All right, folks. So what we're going to talk about now is FStop. So last year we talked about FStop as the measurement of the aperture, and in a loose way that's true. But we're going to go a little bit more in depth of what it means and how it works and why those weird series of numbers. But the things we talked about last year was we said that the smaller the number, okay, of the FStop number, okay, the larger the opening, right? So, and you can work that in reverse, okay? Now, the other thing we talked about was that it was the measurement. So let's look at the aperture now. So here is a representation of different size apertures. Now, remember, the aperture is the opening. The thing around it, okay, is called the iris. So the iris opens and closes in order to give you different size apertures, okay? So this is very simplistic. So here's a circle, 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 circle. Now, an iris and the aperture is essentially a circle. Now, let's look at this in some terms. So if we're talking about, we'll say that this is, I don't know, 1.4. This one is 2. This one's 2.8. And this one's 4. Okay? So remember I said, so the smaller the number, the larger the number, the smaller the number, the larger, right? So, and the other thing that we talked about was that the FStop was represented like this, which is why, so this is divided, so that means that this would give us this number series. And that's also true. But there are two things that are really important in top of FStop if we're trying to understand aperture, okay? The first one, all right, is we need to know the diameter, okay? All right, so you probably know this from math or geometry. And the diameter is the measurement across a circle, right? So that would be the diameter, okay? Now, the other thing we need to know, erase that, okay, is the area. So we have to have the area of a circle. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do all this math, just try to understand the concept. So the area will be all this space, right? Same thing here. Looking at the area of that opening, okay? So, now, the reason that's kind of important, and again, let's put these numbers back. We said that this is 1.4, 2, 2.8, and 4, okay? So, when you go from, say, 2.8 to 2, when you go from this one to this one, what you're doing is you're doubling the light. If you go down, you're halving the light. So it's twice the amount of light, okay? So this measurement, to double the light, we often call that a stop of light, okay? Now, we can do the same thing by doubling the amount of light with shutter speed. We can double it with the ISO, and we'll talk about that when we get to those. But a stop of light means that amount, so you double the amount of light coming in. So if we were looking at these from above, right? So this smaller opening, okay, means that less light can get into it. Same, there's more light in here and more light can get in. The larger the opening, the more light that can get in, okay? So, now, there's another concept that we need to worry about, which is focal length. So now, this is going to be the sensor, okay? And this is the lens, all right? So now, in the camera, the distance between these two, not a very straight line, is called the focal length, okay? So the focal length is this distance. And so oftentimes you'll see lens labeled by their focal length. So you'll see like 30 millimeter, because that's what it's measured in, millimeters, or 50 millimeter, or in the case of a telephoto lens, 300 millimeters, okay? That distance becomes important for the equation. Now I'm going to show you the equation, don't freak out, okay? So it looks like this, okay? So this is how we figure out the FStop number. So if N is the FStop number, so this is the FStop number, equals F, which is the focal length, divided by the diameter of the aperture, okay? This is how we come up with the FStop number, okay? So, just so you have an idea of what this is, I'm not going to ask you to calculate this or any of that kind of thing, but you do need to kind of roughly understand that this is all based off of math. All right, so now all of that stuff brings us to the FStop series, okay? This is the series of numbers, all right? So now, for those of you who are mathematically inclined, do you see any patterns? Some patterns in here. So let's look at this. So so all of this stuff has to do with square root of 2. Okay. So the amount of light, the area, and so far as the diameter is the square root of 2, and I'm not going to get into all of the horrible math that goes with that, but that's why these numbers are strange. But instead of having to do all of that big math, okay, we can look at these in order of patterns. Okay, so I'm just going to draw attention to a couple of them. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. And then these, 1.4, 2.8, 5.6, 11, 22, 44. Now, these are fairly simple. From here to here is doubled. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8, right? Now, on this side, we also do the same thing. 1.4 plus 1.4 is 2.8. So it's times 2. It's just doubled. Okay? Same thing from here. Now, 5.6 to 11. That's a little tricky. We're basically rounding. Okay? We try to make this stuff simple. So, if you do 5.5, right? So this would actually be 11.2, but we don't put the 0.2 when we get to 11. So, if you do that, 5, 11. 11, 22, 44. Now, this is a really small aperture, or FStop number. So if you can remember 1.4 and 1 and 1.4, the first two here, you can come up with this whole series of numbers. You just double it, okay? Now, let's also talk about some other things about lenses. So sometimes when we're looking at lenses, you will sometimes hear something called a fast or a slow lens. Okay, so a fast lens, it doesn't make any sense. A lens, if we're talking about f-stop, because that's really what the deal is, because when we hear fast and slow, we usually think about shutter speed, which we'll get to. But that doesn't have anything to do with the aperture normally. Well, it kind of does. So if we talk about a fast lens, what we're talking about is a lens with a large opening. Large aperture, right? Which means a small f number, okay? Which means that you can have a fast shutter speed because there is more light coming in. Same thing with slow. We're talking about a slow lens. We're talking about a small aperture. We're talking about a large f number, okay? And we're talking about a slow shutter speed. All right, so very quickly, a whole lot of information, but that's the basics of f-stop with a little bit of detail in there. So thank you for listening, and move on to the next part.